If you look at the Premier League table right now, the bottom 3 teams, Ipswich, Leicester and Southampton, are the 3 teams that came up from the Championship the year before. Now, it looks really unlikely that any of these teams will manage to stay up. There's 12 games to go and the closest 2 are Ipswich and Leicester, who sit just behind Wolves. Southampton are pretty much all but relegated already.
I have no idea what I'm doing, but I know I'm doing it really, really well.
Now, if these 3 teams do go back down, this will mark the 2nd year in a row where all 3 promoted teams have been relegated the next season. And a big talking point is, why is this? How do we fix this? Obviously, the league will be very boring if every year the 3 teams that get promoted go straight back down. Now, the way I see it, this argument can be split into 2 branches. The first one is basically the system, that the money distributed across the English pyramid isn't fair. Premier League clubs earn a substantial amount of money more than Championship clubs, to the point where it's probably over double. If you finish even bottom of the Premier League, you make way more money than finishing mid-table in the Championship. So if you've been in the Championship for 10, 15 years and get promoted, financially, how are you ever meant to compete? Now, whilst I think this is a perfectly valid argument, it is one that's been spoken about to death, and it's a bit of a boring topic. Because simply put, the only way to fix it is distribute the money a bit more evenly, which is sort of just down to the Premier League to do, and it looks unlikely that they ever are going to do that. Now, the other branch is to put some of the blame back onto the clubs and say that actually things haven't been great in the decision-making terms from these teams when they've come up. Obviously, it's hard, you've not got anywhere near as much money, you don't have anywhere near the level of players. But if clubs are actively making it more difficult for themselves, it's easier to understand why they keep going straight back down. So let's look at the last 4 seasons, including this one, and let's look at all of the teams that had come up from the previous year. So as I mentioned, this year, Ipswich, Leicester and Southampton were the 3 that came up. Now, just to comment, if these clubs do go down, I think there's a lot of things they could have done differently. For Ipswich, it genuinely could be a case of it's just too much too soon. Kieran McKenna managed back-to-back promotions from League One and the Championship. It was a massive task to ask him to keep this team in the league. And sometimes, unfortunately, that is just the case. Sometimes it's just too much too soon. Ipswich are a great club, Kieran McKenna's clearly a good manager, and they have set themselves in a good place to come back up if they do get relegated. My only fault to Ipswich would be the recruitment. They spent a lot of money in the summer and a lot of it has been on young talent, which will be great from a financial point of view for selling any of these players on. There's definitely going to be big fees coming in for people like Liam Delap and Omari Hutchinson. But when you buy a lot of young players that don't have much Premier League experience, you are going to find it quite difficult to keep that team in the league. As for Leicester, their squad is poor, they are struggling financially, but the decision to sack Steve Cooper and appoint Ruud van Nistelrooy for me was a suicidal appointment. The same could be said for Southampton, their squad is really poor, but letting Russell Martin play that style of football that long is what has relegated them this early.
So bad, I want to give you a 0, but that's not possible. So I give you a 1.
The previous season seen Luton, Burnley and Sheffield United promoted, all 3 were relegated. As for Luton, I think the category falls into the same as Ipswich, where it was just too big a job too soon. Luton done all they could and very nearly stayed up. They held most of their squad together, but unfortunately it was just too much. I think what people forget is just 10 years earlier, Luton were in the 5th division. If you're making that big a rise that quickly, eventually it is going to get to a stage where you just can't go any further. And unfortunately for Luton, they've went back down and kind of collapsed a little bit. Hopefully they can turn things around, but it was just too much too soon. Burnley's a totally different story. They absolutely blitzed the Championship, but I feel like Vincent Kompany let them down. At the time, I thought Burnley were right to stand by him. He did try to play the same style of football in the Premier League that he played in the Championship, which was completely suicidal.
Not a great plan.
However, I actually think Vincent Kompany betrayed Burnley a little bit. Looking back, I start to wonder if he was genuinely playing that because he thought it was the best chance he had to keep Burnley in the league, or if he was just doing it for his own image. Obviously, at the end of the season, with Burnley finishing 19th and getting relegated, he walked out to go straight into the Bayern Munich job. Why Bayern Munich would ever be shopping for a manager that just got relegated with Burnley, I'll never understand. However, it felt like because of his name and because he could prove he could play attacking football with some players who weren't at that level and still have some good moments, it really showcased what he could potentially do at a bigger club, which is why I think he got the job at Bayern. I still think Kompany needs to take a large portion of the blame for why Burnley were relegated that season. And finally this year you had Sheffield. It was just an all-round terrible season for them. But in all honesty, it was a bit of a freak result for them to even end up in the Premier League. The manager that got them there was Paul Heckingbottom, and to be honest, in any other time I've seen Paul Heckingbottom, especially during his stint at Hibernian, he has not impressed me at all. But even then, Sheffield had been in the league previously and they were still suffering from really poor financial decisions they made at the time. The main one for me would be £40 million between Ollie McBurney and Ryan Brewster. But the job was far too big for Sheffield. They just got everything totally wrong. But they do look like they could come up again this season, so... The year before that seen Fulham, Bournemouth and Nottingham Forest all get promoted, and all three stayed up. Fulham actually finished 10th. Now, I totally understand the argument on the money distribution when it comes to Fulham. They had a very good squad, but they did recruit really, really well. They did have Premier League experience previously behind them, but the biggest factor for me was the fact they were able to attract a manager as good as Marco Silva. He played a really pragmatic style of football and it's kept them in the league so far. It's kept them going really well, and Fulham genuinely look a really good team. Bournemouth was a bit of a freak season. Scott Parker was the one who got them promoted, but he was sacked after losing 9-0 to Liverpool.
Oh my god! Oh my god!
Gary O'Neill took over after that, and he managed to get them to stay up, but even in the next season he was gone. I think Bournemouth really survived again, some really good recruitment. They had Premier League experience in their squad, but I still think they've done a lot of things right. And finally you had Nottingham Forest, who have set the trend for a lot of teams that come up from the Championship now. Forest spent an absolute fortune, but to be fair, a lot of the money they were spending it on was on players who had played at a very high level and had a lot of experience. Unlike Ipswich, who have bought a lot of players from the Championship and brung them up. However, at the time, and I still do disagree with Forest doing that, they got away with it and it worked, and they're now flying in the Premier League. But again, their success in the Premier League now has came from much more smarter and reserved recruitment. That even includes the appointment of Nuno Espirito Santo. But you can only imagine how poorly that would have went for Forest if they did get relegated. Having spent that money, having put that amount into their wage bill, if they'd went back down, I could have seen Forest really, really struggling. They took a huge gamble with their future and it paid off.
Gambling is good! I love gambling!
But that isn't anything to say that it would pay off for a lot of teams coming up. And the year before that seen Brentford, Watford and Norwich come up. The only one to survive was Brentford, who finished 13th. They had a lot going for them. Brentford, I think, were one of the few teams that had set themselves up to survive in the Premier League before they'd got there. An excellent club model, their recruitment was very, very, very calculated. Obviously it helped that they had Ivan Toney, but they really trusted in Thomas Frank, and it's worked out for them now. They are 11th in the Premier League at the time I'm recording this. They are a stable Premier League club now, having never had been in the Premier League before this. As for Watford and Norwich, however, they were both really poorly ran. They had no plan to stay up, they had no system to stay up. And it's shown in the fact that since they've went down, neither of the two of them have been anywhere near coming back up. So to go back to reiterate my initial point, I think the argument of money is definitely one that should be listened to. It's a huge factor, obviously, but it is a boring argument and it is one that I don't see changing anytime soon. So I think all clubs can really focus on doing is trying to give themselves the best chance of staying up. And I would basically put that into 3 points. The first one I would say is stop prioritising attacking football. Not every manager's done this. The argument that's been put to a lot of teams that's been promoted recently is they all come up and just try and play like Barcelona. They don't, but some of them have. Mainly being Southampton and the year before Burnley. And it has absolutely blew up in their face. The second point I'd like to focus on is teams really need to keep the squad that got them into the Premier League together. If you go and sign 7, 8, 9, 10 new players in your starting 11, it's not going to work. At least half of your squad needs to stay together. And that ties on to my third point, and it's smart recruitment over a lot of recruitment. Players with Premier League experience, players with even just experience at a high level. You know, there's lots of players at big Premier League clubs who aren't seeing any minutes who would probably relish an opportunity to just go and play consistently for a season. Even if these big players come in and use your club as a stepping stone, even if you have to prove to them, you know, with shorter contracts to keep them there for longer. The main focus is, for the first few years, just on survival, which teams like Fulham, Bournemouth and Brentford have done really well. So that was just some of what I think on why the Premier League has a huge problem with teams staying up. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below if I'm totally wrong or if you agree with what I'm saying. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button, and if you could subscribe, it really helps me out in trying to grow the channel. And I'll see everyone in the next video.